second opinion.
After endless anticipation, Resident Evil 9 is finally here. I've wanted to get into doing reviews since the very start of this channel, and Resident Evil Requiem seemed like the perfect place to start. The only problem is since pretty much all of my subscribers came from my last video,
oh my goodness!
I'm not sure how many of you even know anything about these games. With that in mind, I'm going to try to make this a video for both longtime fans and new players who might be considering picking the game up. Whether you've played through the entire franchise dozens of times, or if you don't know who or what an evil resident even is, this video should be for you. The most natural place to start is probably the perspective, as this game features both first and third person for the player to choose from. I predicted pretty early on when this was announced that Capcom was going to use this game as a way to bridge the gap between people who had gotten into the series through Resident Evil 7 and 8, and those who were introduced through the 3 over-the-shoulder remakes they've released. And I was pretty spot on with that assessment. There are 2 different characters you'll be playing through the game as, and the game actively encourages you to use first person with one and third person for the other. This effectively allows them to get the benefits of both perspectives in a single package. For the more horror-oriented sections of the game, you'll get the greater immersion of first person, just like RE7 and 8, while the more action-focused parts of the game use third person, which lends itself better to the hectic fights where you can often get surrounded on all sides. Grace controls mostly identically to how Ethan did in 7 and 8, although there have been some mechanics from the third-person games that have been carried over, such as the ability to hit an enemy with a melee attack after stunning them with a headshot from Resident Evil 4, and the focus system from Resident Evil 2 and 3's remakes, where you are encouraged to stay in place and take your time to let your sight focus if you want to have the best accuracy and do the most damage. It's a system I like because while you can still move and shoot, there's a higher chance of you missing your target or not killing them, especially if you're just unloading your entire mag on them. The game also does a good job of prioritizing and rewarding stealth through things like the new item Grace can craft that allows her to one-shot zombies if she gets directly behind them. The crafting system itself is based around a new item only Grace receives that allows her to collect infected blood from various places and use it to create new items with the right materials. I'm not really sure how you turn blood into handgun rounds, but I won't question it. The crafting system as a whole is essential to your survival in these portions. As in classic Resident Evil fashion, the game does not give you enough ammo to just blast through everything in sight, especially not without risking taking considerable damage. Leon, meanwhile, feels like you've been dropped right back into RE4 Remake, which essentially means you will just be blasting through everything in sight. Pretty much all of the mechanics from 4 Remake are here, including the parry mechanic, which is probably that game's best inclusion. By pressing a button at the right time, Leon will parry an attack and take no damage at the cost of some durability on his melee weapon, which will eventually break. But unlike in 4 Remake, you don't need to go searching around for a new bladed weapon and can instead just sharpen your current one to repair it. Leon's axe also has a bit more variety to its use than the knife in 4, with both standard light and heavy attacks being options to employ. A rather small mechanic, but one I consider a standout, is Leon's ability to pick up and use weapons dropped by the enemies, letting the player use pieces of the environment to their advantage when fighting the Horde, while also allowing for some very cool specific animations. I really cannot describe how cathartic it is to be the one chopping people apart with a chainsaw for once, and I'm sure many other longtime third-person Resident Evil fans will feel the same. Leon isn't quite as fast as he was in 4 Remake, but that's compensated by the zombies being slower and less grabby than the villagers in 4. It also helps encourage the decision-based gameplay started by RE4. When you make it too easy for the player to avoid enemies, it can make them seem like a non-threat. While here, just like in RE4, you landing your shots and being tactical in your positioning is going to be the difference between taking down all the monsters like an action hero and getting torn apart. Overall, the characters don't really control that differently from each other, which makes it easy to swap between them. Yet with such small differences, Capcom manages to make the experience playing as them completely different. As Grace, you'll be sneaking around, always worried about what's around each corner and how you're going to deal with it using whatever limited supplies you have. While as Leon, you feel like the real threat, easily taking down enemies that Grace needed to rely on stealth to beat, and mowing down horde after horde of the undead. The only thing missing is Doom music. The care center is where the first major chapter of the game takes place, and it's probably the closest thing we've gotten to an original classic Resident Evil location since the fixed camera era. Just like in those games, you're forced to explore a large internal area infested with monsters to search for resources and items, while also solving puzzles throughout the area. Some of the puzzles are a little overly simple, but others feel like something straight out of the original trilogy. Similarly, there's far more backtracking than the mansion in Resident Evil 7 or the castle in 8. You'll need to return to rooms and places you've already visited with new items or information to progress, and sometimes, like the older games, things will change between visits to add new challenges. Zombies can now come back to life again as a more dangerous and aggressive variant, similar to how they do in the remake of Resident Evil 1. I'm not sure if all the zombies will eventually do this like in the first remake, but regardless, it certainly adds some extra stress to revisiting areas. Similarly, there are two mini-boss-like enemies that will roam the west and east wing respectively. Both are difficult to kill and will do a lot of damage if they actually manage to corner you, once again encouraging that you are careful as you search these areas. And if you do manage to kill them, the game gives you a rather nice reward as compensation, similar to Nemesis in the original Resident Evil 3. Unfortunately, while I do like these enemies, one of them did actually cause a problem for me in my first playthrough, where after running away from them in a panic the first time, I realized that I hadn't unlocked the alternate entrance to get into the East Wing, meaning I could only enter through one specific hallway. When I attempted to do so, the monster was essentially just camping the corner, and because of how large he is, I could not run past him. I tried killing him with the limited supplies I had, luring him away, and even just waiting for him to move, but he never seemed to. In the end, I got frustrated and just reloaded to an earlier save, making sure to unlock the door like I was supposed to this time, so that I wouldn't be completely blocked off. It's possible that I was just being impatient, and he would have eventually moved. He certainly seemed to patrol both entrances once the other door was open, but it certainly didn't feel like he was going anywhere no matter what I tried. In the end, it was a result of user error on my part, so I won't be too hard on the game about it. But it is worth considering that there are parts of this game where it can feel like you've soft-locked yourself if you've made a mistake. Luckily though, I never had this issue again. The real star of this section of the game is the girl, the monster that was shown off prominently in the trailers. She serves as the game's stalker enemy, similar to Jack and Lady Dimitrescu in the previous two games, but I'd say she's easily better than both of them. Her first encounter is likely fairly scripted, but it certainly doesn't feel that way when you first play through it, at least compared to some of Jack's portions. And unlike Vampire Lady, who was extremely easy to lose most of the time, she will actively cut you off and force you to take a different path to avoid her. When you encounter her again later on, she's allowed to pursue you much more freely, like Mr. X in RE2 Remake. But unlike X, there are tools to keep her off you, such as keeping the area lit and using a special gun with limited bullets to drive her away. You might think that would make her less scary, but for me that only heightened the intensity of this entire section. Because she's not constantly attached to your hip, you don't know where she is and can't always predict where she'll come from, and you only have so many bullets to stun her with. By the end of this segment, I had completely run out of bullets for the Requiem, and I honestly thought I was completely screwed, but luckily, I had done everything I needed in order to escape. This segment was so well done, it may honestly be the best part of the game. It perfectly manages to be frightening and stressful while avoiding the annoyance of an invincible monster constantly following you around like a toddler. Once you leave that section of the game and enter Raccoon City, Leon becomes far more focused on, and that's where the Resident Evil 4 influence starts to become a lot more blatant, both in the game design and also just the general insanity taking place. The areas you travel through become more linear and easy to navigate, there are a lot more bosses to fight, enemies drop currency again, and there's even a virtual merchant to buy and upgrade your weapons. Some of the upgrades have more subtle effects, but others, like the dot sight, completely change how you aim with the weapon. Overall, I think the game does a good job of recapturing what made the upgrade system in RE4 so fun. Every time I completed the chunk of the story, I was excited to go back to the shop to see what upgrades I could afford. The first few areas you have to travel through do feel a bit like padding, all things considered, but there's enough imagination put into the specific locations you have to fight through to keep the gameplay interesting. Of course, though, it's the return to the RPD that's going to be what most returning players are waiting for. After RE2's remake outright abandoned most of the original soundtrack, it was an absolute delight to walk through those doors again and actually hear a new remix of the iconic theme that doesn't end within the first 5 seconds of being inside the building. Unfortunately, you don't really spend a lot of time in the RPD, but maybe that's for the best. If you had spent too long in there, it might have just started to feel like nostalgia pandering. The areas after the RPD are pretty fun as well, particularly the final lab is a standout, with all of the different varieties of enemies it throws at you. The bosses, meanwhile, are probably the best selection we've gotten since RE4. I can't really think of a single one I disliked, or even found boring compared to the others. I'm not going to spend as long on the story, since I don't want to spoil too much of the game's narrative for people, but I will touch on it for a little bit. You can tell that Capcom heard a lot of the criticisms about the narratives of 7 and 8 and took them into account. The zombies are back rather than mold monsters or werewolves, and Umbrella, or at least the remnants of it, has returned as the game's central antagonist. Grace is a compelling character with a lot of personality and depth, especially compared to who came before her. I never hated Ethan, but if you didn't relate to his everyman archetype, you weren't going to get much out of him. Grace, meanwhile, manages to maintain that relatability Ethan had, while also being a genuinely good character in her own right, to the point where she arguably overshadows Leon at times. When I first bought the game, I was worried that she was going to be playing second fiddle to Leon the whole time, but that couldn't be more untrue. In all honesty, she is the game's actual protagonist. She's the one who the story is actually about. And I'm glad. Leon, to his credit, continues to be great, and this game honestly cemented him as one of the coolest characters to ever exist. Like, just look at this shit. It's nice to see the residual trauma of Raccoon City established in RE4 Remake get built upon more here, and to see him confront it in a more literal way. Although that and some other scenes might imply that the remakes are now canon, which I wouldn't blame people for being mad about. I've defended changes made in those remakes in the past because I've argued that they don't necessarily need to canonically replace the original game, and that they may just be a different take on the events. But now it sort of does just seem like Capcom wants to brush the story of the original RE4, and especially RE2, under the rug. It's also weird that the game focuses so much on harkening back to RE2, yet there are several key characters from that game that are never even mentioned, let alone shown. I'm not saying that they needed to be a huge part of the game, but considering the game puts so much focus on the events of Raccoon City, it is kinda weird that only Leon and Sherry are involved in this. The villains are also a bit of a mixed bag. Gideon is a fun and creepy character who manages to be a convincing threat for the first half of the game, but later on he gets sort of sidelined for this other guy who doesn't really do much aside from Aura Farm on Leon for a bit. I'm at least glad that they had the actual interesting villain return for the final battle, but I think the game's story would be better if you just removed the Wesker knockoff entirely. One thing I do think the climax of the game deserves credit for is the ending. Like in RE7, there's a choice to be made that leads to either the good or bad ending, but unlike in RE7 where the choice is nonsensical and is basically invalidated if you pick the wrong answer, here the choice is much better implemented into the story, and you could honestly stumble into the bad ending if you weren't paying attention, which in this instance, I think is a good thing. Overall, the story's not perfect, but I think it's solid. In my last video where I talked about Resident Evil, I said that the series was in a better place now than it was during the era of Resident Evil 5 and 6, and I stand by that statement. But that doesn't mean there hasn't been issues with the series in the modern era. Resident Evil 7 made the correct decision moving back towards horror and used the first-person perspective as a vehicle to do that, while also bringing back some of the survival horror elements. Resident Evil 8 tried to keep that horror while also adding back some of the features people liked from Resident Evil 4, such as the merchant and treasure system. Both games are still extremely enjoyable experiences, but mechanically speaking, neither are particularly bold. And the stories of both games were so disconnected from the original plot of Resident Evil, they felt more like side adventures than actual continuations of the plot. Aside from the first-person perspective, they feel less like innovation and more like Capcom trying to recapture what they had lost after Resident Evil 4. The remakes were more ambitious with some of the mechanics they added, but you can't really call any of them progression for the franchise when they are inherently tied to games that Capcom had already released years ago. Even if you love them, it's hard to not view them as yet another instance of Capcom trying to revisit their past successes rather than moving forward. I was worried that Requiem was going to be a continuation of this trend, but I'm thankful to say I was wrong. The story manages to serve as a decent continuation of the older game's narrative, and the combination of its horror and action sections make it feel different from pretty much any other game in the series. And I think that's the game's greatest strength. It feels like a culmination of every game released in the modern era. All of the mechanics, all of the lessons, all resulting in a game that is a triumphant step forward for Capcom. The game isn't perfect, of course. There are issues beyond even the ones I mentioned. There's a section near the end of the game that's essentially just a walking simulator, where what you need to do to progress is rather confusing. The lack of music in some areas can still be disappointing, and as of this script, there is no mercenaries mode, or horde mode for the uninitiated. Yet, for every single thing I disliked or found disappointing, I can name half a dozen things I think the game excels at. It manages to feel familiar and different at the same time, and altogether, I think it is easily the best modern game in the series, arguably even including the remakes. As of right now, I'd probably rate it around an 8.5 out of 10. But if the game adds a mercenaries mode without paywalling it, I think that alone would bump it up to a 9. If you're already a fan of the modern games, I'm almost positive you'll like this one too. Whether you're more of a horror fan or an action fan, there's a bit of something for everyone here. If you're an older fan who only likes the fixed camera games in RE4, it's harder for me to be certain you'll enjoy the game. It's certainly the closest we've gotten to those games in a long time, but it still might not be close enough for your taste. And I imagine some people will consider one of the last twists within the story a bit of a retcon. Finally, if you're someone who's never played a Resident Evil game before, I definitely think this game is worth giving a try. It might be a bit awkward for this game's story to be your introduction to the story of Resident Evil, but if you're worried about that, you could always just start with RE2's remake, or, in my opinion preferably, the original Resident Evil 2, which is available on websites like GOG.com. But I understand that a lot of people just don't have any interest in the fixed camera games. Beyond that though, there's not much else to say. Whether you think the game is worth $70, you want to wait for it to drop in price or go on sale, or don't want to buy it at all is up to you. It's hard to definitively tell anyone to buy a game anymore when it's becoming a more expensive hobby every year, but I'd certainly say this game gave me my money's worth, and then some. Take it easy, everyone.